Welcome to the Plain Books Podcast, where we open up a book, delve into its pages, and really extract the most profound insights to shortcut your path to being truly well-informed. Today, we're cracking open a foundational text in psychoanalysis, one that, frankly, reshaped how we understand human connection and the very architecture of our minds. It's a journey into ideas that might just give you some pretty profound aha moments. We're embarking on a deep dive into W.R.D. Fairbairn's Psychoanalytic Studies of the Personality, first published back in 1952.
Yes, Fairbairn's work is really a cornerstone, a true game changer, you could say. He fundamentally reoriented psychoanalysis by placing the child's innate primary need for relationships right at the heart of development. You see, before him, much of the focus in the field was on, well, instinctual drives and the pursuit of pleasure. That was kind of the dominant view. But Fairbairn came along and said, no, it's about relationships. That's the fundamental drive. It's hard for us today, really, to imagine a time when this wasn't a widely accepted truism, but back then it was a truly radical idea. His entire model of how our inner psychic structure is built, it's all based on how we internalize and then modify our experiences with parents and other, critically important people in our early lives. And he beautifully illuminated how our ego, our sense of self, grapples with the inevitable dissatisfactions in these relationships. It does this through a complex process, internalizing the significant other, the object, then splitting off parts of the ego, which leads to the repression of those really painful internal object relations.
So our mission today is to truly explore Fairbairn's groundbreaking object relations theory. We want to understand his significant critiques of Freud and ultimately uncover how those earliest relationships of ours shape, well, pretty much everything. From our core personality to our deepest anxieties and even the very social structures we build around us. We're going to discuss the entire book, drawing out its key stories and powerful quotes. And we challenge you, our listener, to let these pertinent ideas enhance your own life and deepen your understanding of yourself and others.
And what's fascinating about Fairbairn's intellectual journey, I think, is that he was quite unique. He worked for long stretches in relative isolation. He was literally hundreds of miles from his nearest psychoanalytic colleagues in London, which, maybe surprisingly, allowed him this kind of pure concentration. He could develop his ideas purely from his daily clinical experience, uninfluenced by groupthink, perhaps, leading to this undeniable originality in his thought. It's a real testament to critical thinking and deep self-reflection, and it gives his insights a particular kind of purity.
Okay, so what can you expect from this deep dive into his work? We're going to take a conversational journey through Fairbairn's arguments. We'll start by understanding the basic building blocks of his proposed psychic structure, then move into the fascinating nuances of what he called schizoid states. From there, we'll explore the dynamic processes of repression and even touch on the broader sociological implications of his theory. And don't worry, we'll delve into the captivating case studies and dream analyses straight from the book itself. We really encourage you to actively participate throughout our discussion by reflecting on these ideas as we present them. Ask yourself, how do these concepts resonate with your own experiences, your own relationships?
Yeah, definitely keep that in mind as we go.
All right, let's dive into the revolutionary core. Relationships over instincts.
Right. At the absolute core of Fairbairn's psychoanalytic studies of the personality is this truly profound reorientation of psychoanalytic thought. He makes a bold assertion, stating that a child's fundamental need for relationships is the central driver of development. Not, as Freud and his followers had largely emphasized, the primary pursuit of pleasure or instinctual gratification. This isn't just a minor tweak to existing theory, it's a complete paradigm shift. It really is. The core insight here is that, for Fairbairn, we are fundamentally relational beings from birth, hardwired for connection. Our entire personality, our sense of self, how we interact with the world, it's all shaped by these early relational experiences.
And what's so powerful about that shift is that his entire model of our psychic structure, that inner architecture of our mind, is built upon how we internalize and then subtly modify our experiences with parents and other key figures in our early lives. We literally take those relationships inside us.
Exactly. And when these crucial early relationships are, as they inevitably are, unsatisfying in some ways, because let's face it, no parent is perfect. No relationship completely fulfills every single need. Our self, our ego, has to find a way to cope with that disappointment. Fairbairn describes a complex, dynamic process. We internalize the significant other, the object, into our inner world. Then our ego begins to split off parts of itself, particularly those parts associated with the painful or frustrating aspects of those internal object relations. This splitting is then followed by the repression of those really difficult, unwelcome experiences. It's a defense mechanism, yes, but one that fundamentally shapes who we become.
That's a profound shift, isn't it? because it means our drive isn't just for a primal satisfaction of needs, but for connection. And what's equally compelling is how this book, this single work, laid the groundwork for so many others. Fairbairn's theories became the absolute starting point for some truly seminal work in the field. For instance, his ideas directly influenced John Bowlby's groundbreaking work on attachment theory. I mean, that completely revolutionized our understanding of infant caregiver bonds, emphasizing their deep, enduring psychological significance.
Oh, absolutely. Bowlby is huge, and Fairbairn's influence there is undeniable. Not only that, but his work profoundly shaped Harry Guntrip and John D. Sutherland's extensive writings on the self, really exploring the very nature of personal identity through a relational lens. And Henry Dix's contributions to understanding marital dynamics, how couples interact, that drew heavily from Fairbairn's relational perspective, showing how partners unconsciously reenact early object relations. And think about Otto Kernberg's effective treatment approaches for severe personality disorders. Those also found their genesis in Fairbairn's object relations theory. Even more contemporary developments, like Stephen Mitchell's relational theory, they acknowledge their significant debt to Fairbairn's pioneering insights.
These aren't minor figures in psychology. These are absolute giants in their own right, and Fairbairn was their intellectual springboard. What's truly fascinating here is how one person's original thought, especially when developed in relative isolation, like you said, can ripple through an entire field, fundamentally altering its trajectory for decades to come. It demonstrates the enduring power and sheer impact of a genuinely fresh perspective.
It really does. And to understand how Fairbairn arrived at such a radical new perspective, we have to look at his intellectual journey. He wasn't just a clinician analyzing patients. He was also a deep philosophical thinker who questioned the very assumptions of his time. His initial discomfort with traditional psychoanalytic theory, particularly Freud's structural theory, that ego, id, superego model we all learn about, and his libido theory, it compelled him down a path of radical recasting. And this wasn't by chance. His early studies in mental philosophy at Edinburgh University steeped him in the works of philosophical giants like Kant, Hegel, and Lotze. This robust classical background, combined with additional studies in Greek philosophy and German language, provided a powerful philosophical foundation that profoundly informed his critical approach to psychology. He was uniquely equipped, you could say, to challenge the intellectual titans of his era from multiple angles, bringing a philosophical rigor to clinical observations.
So what does this all mean? It means he wasn't just a clinician. He was a deep philosophical thinker who questioned the very assumptions of his time. Okay, so let's get into how he challenged Freud more directly, starting with structure.
Right. So Fairbairn's critique of Freud's structural theory, the ego, id, and superego model, was incredibly incisive. He argued that Freud essentially mistook psychic functions and phenomena for structures. For Fairbairn, while he certainly agreed on the observable phenomenon of a superego, that internal critical voice, he concluded that its functions don't actually rest on a separate structure imposed on the ego. Instead, he saw superego development as analogous to object identification, but with an added crucial step he called sentiment formation. This, he considered, was a first step towards personalizing what he termed endopsychic structure, basically the inner architecture of our mind.
That's a very academic way to put it. Can you help us unpack endopsychic structure and sentiment formation a bit more conversationally? What does that really mean for how our inner world is built?
Absolutely. Think of endopsychic structure as the internal blueprint of our personality, the way our mind is organized on the inside. Freud pictured it as distinct, separate compartments like the id, ego, and superego. Fairbairn, however, saw it as more fluid, more integrated, built from our internalizing relationships. And sentiment formation is about how, as we internalize these early relationships, we also develop emotional attitudes or sentiments towards them. It's not just a copy, it's an emotional modification that begins to shape our unique inner world, moving us beyond simple identification to a more personalized internal dynamic. He famously questioned, how can the ego be repressed if it's itself the structural agent of repression? That's a real mind-bender, right? This led him to the radical idea that the ego and superego aren't static, energyless structures that merely receive energy from the id. Instead, he saw them as dynamic entities, where a constant dialectic relationship between them continually alters and influences both.
So he's saying that energy and structure are inseparable. The way we relate internally isn't just about impulses, it's about how these inner structures influence each other.
Precisely. Fairbairn proposed that energy and structure are fundamentally inseparable. Superego functions, in his view, are primarily matters of internal object relations and mutual influence, rather than a separate, static moral authority. It was in this context, in fact, that he first used the term organized self instead of ego, moving towards a much more personalized understanding of this inner endopsychic structure. He was trying to emphasize that it's our self, organized by our experiences, not just a generic ego.
That's a really deep rethinking of the mind's internal workings. Now let's talk about libido. Freud's idea of libido as primarily pleasure-seeking is so ingrained in popular culture. How did Fairbairn flip that premise?
Well, Fairbairn truly challenged Freud's libido theory, shifting it dramatically from pleasure-seeking to object-seeking. He rejected Freud's view that libido is primarily about seeking pleasure or gratifying instincts, a concept he traced to the significant influence of Helmholtz on 19th century scientific thought, which favored a purely mechanistic view of energy. Fairbairn's argument was quite philosophical here. He said, and I'll quote him from the book because it's quite specific, Freud's view that libido is primarily pleasure-seeking follows directly from his divorce of energy from structure. For, once energy is divorced from structure, the only psychical change which can be envisaged as other than disturbing, i.e. as pleasant, is one which makes for the establishment of an equilibrium of forces, i.e. directionless change. Then he contrasts it. By contrast, if we conceive of energy as inseparable from structure, then the only changes which are intelligible are changes in structural relationships and in relationships between structures.
Wow, okay, that's a dense but profound quote. What I hear him saying is that if you separate energy from the actual parts of the mind, then pleasure just becomes about reducing tension, a kind of generic, directionless discharge. But if energy is tied to specific mental structures, then our motivations must be about dynamic relationships between those structures.
Exactly. Fairbairn essentially flips Freud's premise on its head. It's not primarily about seeking pleasure from an object. It's about fundamentally seeking the object itself, the connection. The pleasure, or the lack thereof, then becomes a secondary consequence that arises from the quality of that object relationship. If the relationship is good, we experience pleasure. If it's bad, we experience pain. It's a subtle but profoundly different way of understanding human motivation, grounding it in relationship rather than raw instinct.
That's a powerful reframing. But if libido isn't primarily pleasure-seeking, what happens to the idea of gratification? Does Fairbairn fully account for the undeniable pull of pleasure in human experience?
Oh, he absolutely does, but he recontextualizes it. For Fairbairn, pleasure is important, but it's a sign that an object-seeking aim is being fulfilled rather than the primary aim itself. It's the byproduct of a successful connection, a meaningful interaction with an object. Think of it this way. A hungry baby isn't just seeking the pleasure of a full stomach, it's seeking the breast, the mother, the relationship that provides sustenance and comfort. The gratification comes with the successful object relationship. This reevaluation was deeply intertwined with his doctoral thesis from way back in 1929 titled Dissociation and Repression, where he explored contributions from leading figures like Freud, Janet Rivers, and McDougall.
So he was already laying the groundwork for this relational view even back then. What did he conclude about dissociation and repression in that early work?
He concluded that dissociation is actually a general human capacity, a widespread phenomenon where we can mentally separate parts of our experience. Repression, in his view, is a more specific instance of dissociation, specifically related to what is unpleasant. And crucially, he observed that the dissociated elements consist essentially in tendencies belonging to mental structure. That's a key phrase. He widens the definition of unpleasant beyond simple physical gratification, expanding it to include the profound affective or emotional component of experience. This moves him towards his later, more developed contention that what is repressed is the painful experience of failures of loving care, those moments when our innate desire to be loved as a person and to have our love accepted is frustrated. This, he argued, is what the infant perceives as most unpleasant. This formed the critical background for his revolutionary idea of personality splitting, occurring under the impact of this frustration of his desire to be loved as a person and to have his love accepted. The ego actively defends against this deepest pain by compartmentalizing these experiences and the parts of the self involved.
That idea of personality splitting due to early relational frustrations is so key to Fairbairn. Okay, now that we understand that foundation, let's explore how this impacts his understanding of mental illness itself, particularly the pervasive schizoid experience.
Right, the schizoid universe, as he sometimes described it. Fairbairn really found schizoid processes to be absolutely central to psychopathology. He saw them as offering unrivaled opportunities to study the very foundations of personality and our most basic mental processes. What's truly fascinating here, and maybe a bit shocking, is his bold claim that everyone without exception must be regarded as schizoid, with a crucial qualification. It depends entirely on the mental level considered. He argued that the fundamental schizoid phenomenon is the presence of splits in the ego, our core sense of self, which are invariably present at the deepest mental levels. Even in normal people, these splits can manifest under extreme suffering, hardship, or deprivation. Think of conditions like grave illness, the intense isolation of Arctic exploration, or the profound horrors experienced in modern warfare. The key, he believed, is the mental depth that needs to be plumbed for this evidence of ego splitting to reveal itself. He felt some measure of splitting is always present at the deepest mental level, reflecting what Melanie Klein had termed the basic schizoid paranoid position in the psyche.
So, if our ego splits, what does that actually feel like in everyday life for someone who isn't schizophrenic? Can you give us a relatable example of this deeper schizoid process at work? Because everyone is schizoid. Sounds pretty intense.
It does sound intense, but yeah, it's relatable. Think about that strange palm you might experience in the midst of a serious crisis. Almost like you're observing yourself from a distance or looking on at oneself in an embarrassing or paralyzing situation. You feel detached, almost like it's not really happening to you. Even phenomena like déjà vu, that peculiar confusion of past and present or fantasy and reality, are, for Fairbairn, essentially subtle schizoid phenomena. They hint at a deeper splitting or disengagement within the self.
That's a powerful way to look at it. I can definitely relate to that feeling of stepping outside yourself during stress.
Yeah.
And you mentioned dreams, too. How do they fit in?
Yes, Fairbairn offers dreams as almost conclusive proof that everyone is schizoid at these deeper levels. As Ferd's research showed, the dreamer themselves is commonly represented by two or more separate figures in a dream. Fairbairn takes this further, suggesting that all figures in dreams represent either some part of the dreamer's personality or an object with whom some part of their personality has a relationship in inner reality. The very fact that a dreamer is characteristically represented by multiple figures in a dream is, to him, clear evidence of ego splitting different parts of ourself interacting internally.
That makes so much sense. It's like our subconscious is always showing us the different roles and relationships within our own mind. So beyond these more subtle universal manifestations, Fairbairn also categorized more overt schizoid conditions. What were those?
He did, meticulously. He grouped schizoid conditions into three main categories. First, there's schizophrenia proper, which is the most overt and severe manifestation. Second, he identified the psychopathic personality of a schizoid type, a group he believed comprised the majority of psychopathic personalities, even including epileptic personalities, all characterized by a profound lack of emotional connection and a tendency to treat others as objects. And finally, there's the schizoid character, a much larger group of individuals whose personalities embody definite schizoid traits, but who couldn't reasonably be regarded as psychopathic in the clinical sense. They function, but with a pervasive sense of detachment or introversion.
Beyond these overt conditions, Fairbairn identified even more subtle, sometimes transient manifestations of schizoid processes. What were some of those clues?
He pointed to feelings of artificiality, whether referring to oneself or one's environment, that chilling plate glass feeling where you feel disconnected, as if there's a pane of glass between you and the world. There's also unfamiliarity with familiar persons or settings, and conversely, a strange familiarity with the unfamiliar. Déjà vu again, basically. These are often subtle clues, but they point to deeper internal processes of splitting and detachment. What's even more intriguing, and contrary to common belief at the time, is his finding that schizoid individuals who haven't regressed too far can actually have greater psychological insight. This is attributed to their introversion and familiarity with their own deeper psychological processes, which others might keep firmly repressed. He also noted their remarkable capacity for intense transference in therapy, presenting unexpectedly favorable therapeutic possibilities. This raises an important question for you, listening right now. What can we learn from those who are deeply attuned to their inner worlds, even if that attunement comes with profound struggles and a pervasive sense of detachment?
That's a powerful thought, that detachment can sometimes foster a unique kind of internal clarity. You also mentioned the early oral phase as critical to schizoid development. How does that connect to what he called the tendency to orientation towards a partial object?
It's a critical link. For Fairbairn, schizoid development commences in the very early oral phase, closely associated with the libidinal attitude of oral incorporation, meaning the infant's primary way of relating to the world is through taking things in, often through the mouth. An intensified fixation in this phase, he argued, leads directly to schizoid characterology and symptomatology. One significant factor here is the tendency to orientation towards a partial object. This describes the schizoid tendency to treat other people not as whole, complex individuals with inherent value, but as less than persons. Instead of relating to the whole person, they relate to a part or a function the other person serves, much like an infant relates to the breast rather than the whole mother.
Here's a specific detail from the book that illustrates this powerfully, bringing you right into a clinical context. Fairbairn describes a highly intelligent schizoid man who came to him because he couldn't connect emotionally with his wife. He was unduly critical and often morose when affection was called for. He admitted to a very selfish attitude, stating he treated his wife and others, more or less, as if they were lower animals. Fairbairn notes that animals commonly figure in dreams as symbols of bodily organs, confirming that his attitude was towards a partial object, not a whole person. He wasn't seeing his wife as a complete individual, but rather as a collection of functions or parts. Another patient, who was frankly schizophrenic, vividly described his attitude towards people he met as being like that of an anthropologist among a tribe of savages. These are such stark examples of the pervasive, often unconscious, way schizoid individuals interact with the world, reflecting their internal splits and the very early oral fixation. They highlight how deeply this way of relating can permeate every interaction.
Yeah, those examples really hit home, don't they? They show how abstract theory translates into lived experience. And Fairbairn's work didn't just redescribe schizoid conditions, it led to a substantial revision of prevailing ideas about their prevalence and significance, completely recasting classical psychoanalytical concepts. He fundamentally disagreed with the notion, largely proposed by Carl Abraham, that conditions like paranoid, obsessional, hysterical, and phobic states are products of fixations at specific libidinal phases, meaning developmental arrests at a particular stage of sexual development, like the anal or phallic stage. Instead, Fairbairn argued that these are simply a variety of techniques employed to defend the ego against the effects of conflicts of an oral origin.
So he's saying these aren't about getting stuck at a certain phase, like being anal retentive or whatever, but rather they're elaborate defenses against a much deeper, more fundamental relational conflict stemming from early oral experiences.
Precisely. He found that an underlying oral conflict is invariably present, and these symptoms are common accompaniments or precursors of deeper schizoid and depressive states. Crucially, he posited that schizoid and depressive states themselves are not defenses. Instead, they are primary core conditions against which the ego needs to defend itself. This is a vital distinction. The ego isn't defending against an anal or phallic impulse, as Freud might suggest, but against the deeper, more profound pain of a schizoid or depressive core, which is rooted in failures of early object relationships.
That radically shifts the understanding of the origins of neuroses. He also re-envisioned the concept of libidinal development itself, moving from Freud's idea of distinct phases to stages defined by object relationships. Can you explain that distinction for us?
Certainly. In infancy, due to the very nature of the human organism, the path of least resistance to the object is almost exclusively through the mouth. This naturally makes the mouth the dominant libidinal organ, and the libidinal attitude is predominantly oral because it is incorporative, meaning we take things in. However, Fairbairn argues that in maturity, while the genital organs do provide a path of least resistance for certain kinds of relating, they do so in parallel with other channels. The mature individual seeks objects through multiple differentiated channels, integrating various aspects of themselves into the relationship.
So it's not just about what the body does, but how it's doing it in relation to others. It's about the quality of the connection.
Exactly. For Fairbairn, it's not that the adult attitude is characteristically genital in isolation, but rather mature. True genital sexuality, for him, is attained when satisfactory object relationships have been established, not the other way around. He defines mature dependence beautifully as a capacity on the part of the differentiated individual for cooperative relationships with differentiated objects. This implies a relationship characterized by evenly matched giving and taking, with an absence of primary identification and incorporation. You're relating as a separate whole person, not trying to merge or take in the other. This is the ideal, of course, though never fully realized in practice, as no one's libidinal development proceeds entirely without a hitch.
That makes perfect sense. It's about a whole person relationship, not just a physical act. And speaking of physical acts, Fairbairn also offered a fresh perspective on autoerotism, things like thumb sucking. How did he view that beyond simple pleasure seeking?
He really broadened our understanding there, too. He posited that autoerotism, such as thumb sucking, isn't just about obtaining pleasure from one's own body. Instead, it's a technique for an individual to provide for themselves what they cannot obtain from an external object. It's a way to provide an object internally when one isn't available externally, a relationship with an internalized object. This activity originates in an oral context and always retains the impress of its oral origins. Furthermore, the anal and phallic phases, often considered distinct libidinal stages by Freud, are, for Fairbairn, merely libidinal aspects of techniques for dealing with these incorporated objects. This leads to his powerful conclusion. It is not the libidinal attitude which determines the object relationship, but the object relationship which determines the libidinal attitude. This fundamentally inverts the traditional Freudian emphasis. The relationship comes first, and the libidinal expression follows.
That's a huge inversion, and it highlights just how deeply Fairbairn rethought these foundational ideas. As development proceeds, what happens to the child's initial ambivalence, that mix of love and hate towards a single object, like the mother?
As that ambivalence begins to give way, Fairbairn described a crucial process, the dichotomy of the object. The original ambivalent object, say the mother, who is both loving and frustrating, is split into an accepted object towards which love is directed and a rejected object towards which hate is directed. Both of these, he noted, tend to be treated as internalized objects within the child's inner world. The rejection of the bad object is an all-important part of abandoning infantile dependence, leading to what he termed rejective techniques. This is where Abraham's concept of the anal phases comes in. Fairbairn saw defecation, which is biologically a rejective act, as exploited psychologically as a symbol of the emotional rejection of the object. It readily forms the basis of these rejective mental techniques.
So a child learning to control their bowels isn't just about physical development, it's also about learning to manage and reject internal bad objects, emotionally speaking. That's fascinating. And you also mentioned hysteria as a rejective technique, not a fixation. This sounds like it directly challenges Freud's Oedipus situation.
It absolutely does. Hysteria, for Fairbairn, is another compelling example of a state resulting from a special rejective technique, rather than being a fixation at the phallic stage, as Abraham suggested. Fairbairn's findings, especially from his clinical work, strongly suggested a significant misconception of the Oedipus situation in classical theory.
Okay, let's talk about Freud's famous Oedipus situation. The idea that a child unconsciously desires the parent of the opposite sex and competes with the same-sex parent. It's a cornerstone of Freudian theory. How did Fairbairn's relational view reframe this?
Fairbairn didn't dismiss the phenomenon entirely, but he saw its roots differently. Psychologically, its deeper significance is not the triangular drama itself, but rather the differentiation of a single ambivalent object, typically the primary caregiver, usually the mother, into two. An accepted parent and a rejected parent. The guilt attached to the Oedipus situation, accordingly, isn't primarily from its triangular sexual nature, as Freud suggested, but from two core relational facts. First, that the incestuous wish represents a desperate demand for parental love that doesn't seem freely bestowed. And second, the child's dawning sense that their own love is rejected because it is perceived as bad. It's a tragedy of unrequited love and a damaged sense of self-worth, really.
Consider a powerful patient anecdote from the book that really brings this home. Fairbairn describes a female patient whose parents, due to disagreements, occupied separate bedrooms. Her mother, to protect herself, made the patient sleep in the interconnecting dressing room between them. The patient received very little affection and experienced greater difficulty connecting emotionally with her detached father. After her mother's death in her teens, she made desperate, futile attempts to establish contact with her father. It was then that the thought occurred to her, surely it would appeal to him if I offered to go to bed with him. Her so-called incestuous wish was not a primary sexual drive, but a desperate attempt to make an emotional connection, to finally elicit love, and to prove her own love was acceptable, not bad. This wasn't Oedipus as a primary sexual drive, but a desperate move in the face of profound emotional neglect and a deep-seated sense of her own love being bad. Her inability to eat in front of others without nausea further showed a regression to the oral stage, where the breast was reinstated as an object due to her profoundly unsatisfactory emotional relationship with her mother. It's a vivid illustration of how object relationships, not just instinctual phases, determine psychopathology.
That case is so illustrative, isn't it? It really underscores his point about the primacy of the relationship. Okay, so let's turn our attention now to the deeper psychopathology rooted in what Fairbairn called infantile dependence. This isn't just a state of being young, it's a fundamental condition. Infantile dependence is unconditional. The infant relies entirely on their object, their primary caregiver. not only for their very existence and physical well-being, but also for the satisfaction of their profound psychological needs. The loss of a single object, therefore, is devastating. It truly presents as a choice between life and death for the infant. This dependence is profoundly accentuated by identification, where the object is not only the child's world, but also, in a way, themselves. They haven't yet differentiated fully, so the boundaries between self and object are incredibly fluid.
So the infant essentially is the object, in a psychological sense, making separation or loss truly terrifying. And you said the schizoid conflict is even more devastating than depressive states. Why is that? What makes it worse?
It's because the schizoid conflict is rooted in the early oral phase, where the primary concern is the potential destructiveness of one's own love. The schizoid individual's tragedy is that their love seems to destroy. They become so afraid to love that they erect profound barriers between themselves and others, rejecting objects and withdrawing their libido, their capacity to connect and invest emotionally. This withdrawal of libido can go to extreme lengths, leading to the renunciation of all emotional and physical contacts, a complete loss of interest in the world, where everything becomes meaningless. The individual becomes profoundly introverted, retreating to internalized objects, those inner representations of past relationships. In fact, Fairbairn suggests that the introvert is fundamentally schizoid, using introversion as a primary defense. In acute states, this withdrawal of libido can feel as if the ego itself has completely withdrawn into the unconscious, leading to a profound loss of identity, a feeling as if there were nothing of him, or as if he had lost his identity, or even as if he were dead.
The ultimate psychopathological disaster, then, is the loss of the ego itself. That's truly chilling to imagine.
It is. The loss of the ego is the ultimate psychopathological disaster that the schizoid individual constantly struggles to avert. This constant struggle to avoid emotional relationships with external objects is a desperate effort on the part of an ego perpetually threatened with this kind of internal annihilation. This raises an important question for you, our listener, to consider. How much of our everyday detachment, our moments of feeling disconnected or numb, or even our tendency to avoid deep intimacy is a subtle, perhaps unconscious form of this defensive withdrawal? Are we protecting ourselves from a perceived destructiveness of our own love, or from the pain of rejection that feels too overwhelming to bear?
That's a powerful and relatable thought. Now let's contrast that with the depressive conflict. You mentioned it has its roots in the late oral phase, and the problem for the depressive isn't love, but hate. How does that play out?
Exactly. For the depressive, the great problem is the disposal of hate, not love. Depressives are spared the devastating feeling that their love itself is bad, so they remain inherently capable of libidinal relationships, of connecting with others. Their difficulty stems from ambivalence, the inability to fully separate the good and bad aspects of an object. They are more successful than schizoids in substituting direct aggression, like biting, for simple rejection, but they often fail to achieve the clear dichotomy of the object, that complete splitting into all good and all bad objects. This leads to an enduring ambivalence towards the incorporated object, where love and hate remain inextricably linked. Fairbairn explains involutional melancholia, for instance, a severe form of depression historically associated with the midlife transition by the waning libidinal urges in the climacteric, while aggression remains strong, reactivating the earlier situation of object loss. For the depressive, the loss of the object is the basic trauma, and like the schizoid state, the depressive state is not a defense, but a primary condition against which the individual seeks to defend themselves, often using transitional techniques to control their aggression and manage their internal objects.
So the child sacrifices internal peace for external security. That's a profound dilemma, isn't it? Here's a powerful idea that encapsulates a profound insight into how we cope with early relational failures. Fairbairn suggests that the child would rather be bad himself than have bad objects. Can you expand on what he means by this moral defense?
This is truly a cornerstone of his theory, and it's a profound insight into the human condition. When a child is faced with bad objects, parents who are consistently frustrating, rejecting, or ambivalently present, it's an intolerable, chaotic situation for an infant dependent on them for survival. To preserve the external world as safe and to maintain a connection to their caregivers, the child, in an unconscious attempt to make their objects good and secure their environment, takes on the burden of badness from those objects. They internalize that badness. This outer security, however, comes at the steep price of inner insecurity, as his ego is henceforth left at the mercy of a band of internal fifth columnists or persecutors.
It's like an internal enemy within. Saboteurs, almost.
Exactly. Fifth columnists, persecutors, saboteurs, whatever you call them. This is what Fairbairn called the moral defense. It converts an original situation of being surrounded by bad external objects into one where external objects are now perceived as good, and the self, the child, is now bad. It's a more civilized level of defense, where the superego begins to operate. He uses a striking analogy to explain this. It is better to be a sinner in a world ruled by God than to live in a world ruled by the devil. A sinner in God's world still has hope of redemption, a sense of underlying order and justice, even if they've transgressed. In a world ruled by the devil, there is no security, no hope, only chaos. This defense buys a precarious inner peace by accepting self-blame, because self-blame is less terrifying than a world where the people meant to protect you are fundamentally bad.
That's incredibly powerful. That what we often see as self-blame or a harsh inner critic isn't necessarily a sign of true badness, but a desperate, unconscious strategy by a child to make sense of a confusing, potentially bad environment. So from a psychopathological standpoint, where does guilt fit into this? Is it the core issue?
Well, from a psychopathological standpoint, Fairbairn views guilt, rather than being an ultimate moral truth, as a defense, operating as a powerful resistance in psychotherapy. Interpreting exclusively at the guilt or superego level can be problematic. A coercive psychotherapist, by focusing too much on guilt, risks becoming a bad object or a harsh superego figure to the patient, potentially intensifying symptoms or driving repression even deeper. The deepest source of resistance, Fairbairn argues, is not guilt itself, but the profound fear of releasing these internalized bad objects from the unconscious, which can make the world feel terrifying, unstable, and persecutory. The analytical aim, then, is to help the patient confront and eventually integrate these internalized bad objects in a safe, therapeutic relationship, even if it stirs up anxiety initially. It's about bringing them out of the shadows.
That makes so much sense. It's not about making the patient feel guilty, but helping them integrate those difficult inner parts. Fairbairn also had a different take on Freud's repetition compulsion, that drive to repeat traumatic experiences. He argued it wasn't needed if libido is object-seeking. How did he explain the phenomenon of re-experiencing trauma, or being haunted?
He explained it quite elegantly, actually. If libido is primarily object-seeking, then Freud's repetition compulsion isn't strictly necessary as a primary drive. Instead, Fairbairn suggests if trauma releases bad objects from the unconscious, the difficulty will be to see how the patient can get away from these bad objects. The individual is simply haunted by them, plagued by these internal persecutors that have been reactivated. And since these internal objects are framed by the original traumatic incident, the individual is also haunted by the trauma itself, not because they are compelled to repeat it for pleasure, but because the internal bad objects demand attention. They won't stay buried. They can only achieve freedom if these objects are banished again, often through an access of repression.
Think of the soldier Fairbairn describes who, after a traumatic experience, says, "I don't want to talk about these things. I want to go home and forget about all that." This isn't a compulsion to repeat trauma. It's the ego's desperate attempt to escape the haunting of those released bad objects by re-repressing them. It's a fundamental defensive maneuver. Fairbairn also found Freud's death instinct superfluous, explaining anti-libidinal factors through the cathexis or emotional investment of internalized bad objects. He argued that these anti-libidinal factors, the forces that seem to work against life or connection, are not an inherent drive towards death, but rather the dynamic consequences of the ego's ongoing, often painful relationship with its internal persecutors.
Exactly. It simplifies the model in a way by grounding everything in these object relations. Fairbairn, in his clinical work, really found what he called impulse psychology, a focus on instincts existing purely as isolated impulses, to be singularly sterile, especially when working with schizoid patients. His key insight was profound. What an individual shall do with his impulses is clearly a problem of object relationships. Impulses, he asserted, cannot be considered apart from endopsychic structures or the complex web of object relationships. They are, in fact, the dynamic aspect of ego structures, not separate entities floating around. From a practical psychotherapeutic standpoint, simply analyzing impulses in isolation proved ineffective.
He offers a vivid example of this. A patient who, when presented with interpretations in terms of impulses, would describe elaborate oral sadistic fantasies. She was deriving narcissistic satisfaction from this intellectual exercise, but making no real therapeutic movement. She was merely the recorder of remarkable events, describing these internal dramas as if from a distance, without her central ego truly participating or confronting the emotional charge. The real problem, Fairbairn understood, was how to release those dynamic charges, those impulses, in the context of reality and actual object relationships, to help her truly engage with them, rather than just narrate them.
That's right. He also cites a patient with frigidity, nausea, and a desire to go to the lavatory as compelling examples where the quality of the object relationship, not just the oral or anal impulse, was paramount. Her nausea, for instance, was a transference phenomenon, an attitude towards her mother and her mother's breast, mediated by her father, all as internalized objects. Her desire to go to the lavatory signified a rejection of the libidinal object as its contents, but also a cathartic discharge of libidinal tension. It indicated a willingness to express libidinal feelings, albeit falling short of direct, mature genital expression. It's all about the relational context, you see.
That really brings the theory to life. It's not just about an impulse, but what that impulse means in terms of relationship. Fairbairn further posited that if libido is primarily object-seeking, then our behavior must be oriented towards reality from the very beginning. How does this challenge Freud's pleasure principle?
It's another fundamental departure. The pleasure principle, in Fairbairn's view, ceases to be the primary principle of behavior. Instead, it becomes a subsidiary principle, coming into play only when the reality principle fails. He gives a simple example: a moth seeking a flame. It's not seeking pleasure, but light and object. Its reality sense is limited, so it can't differentiate between a natural light source and a destructive one, but its behavior is still fundamentally object-seeking. It's driven by the object, not just by the sensation of pleasure.
Another powerful example is a paralyzed man who, due to a cervical spine fracture, turned book pages with his tongue. Fairbairn argues such behavior on his part does not, of course, lend itself to be explained in terms of an intense oral fixation. He used his mouth to turn the pages because this organ was the only organic channel open to him for the purpose. This wasn't an intense oral fixation, as Freud might interpret it, but rather the only available channel for an object-seeking aim to engage with the book, which represents a connection to knowledge, to the world. On a similar principle, a child uses its mouth for breast-seeking because it is the available, adapted organ. The mouth is only oral because it is breast-seeking, not vice versa. This vividly illustrates that the choice of libidinal channel is determined by an organ's appropriateness to the aim, its availability, and the sanction of experience.
This is crucial for understanding his 3 stages of libidinal development, which are fundamentally object relationship-based, not instinct-based phases like Freud's.
Let's break those down. What's the first stage?
The first is the stage of infantile dependence. This is the earliest stage, where the child's natural object is the mother's breast. Dependence is extreme, absolute really. And primary identification is key, meaning the child hasn't yet fully differentiated from the object. Consequently, separation anxiety becomes the greatest source of distress, as losing the object feels like losing a part of oneself. This involves an oral incorporative attitude, sure, but primarily it's about the dependence itself, the absolute need for the object for connection and survival.
And then, as the child grows, they enter the second stage, which sounds complicated.
Right. Following this is the transitional stage, which Fairbairn describes as prolonged and incredibly complicated, full of vicissitudes, challenges, and changes arising from the conflicts of transition. This is where the defensive techniques we discussed earlier, paranoid, obsessional, hysterical, and phobic behaviors arise. There are ways for the ego to deal with the difficulties of establishing relationships with differentiated external objects and managing internalized objects. It's a complex process of trying to get rid of early internalized, often bad objects without losing them entirely, or at least managing their impact. It's a tricky balance between holding on to the comfort of internal objects while daring to engage with the external world. It's where most psychopathology originates, really.
And finally, the ideal, but perhaps never fully achieved, third stage.
Exactly. Finally, we reach the stage of mature dependence. This is the ideal final stage, characterized by the heterosexual genital organs as the appropriate biological channel for relating. But it's more than just a physical act. It's about cooperative relationships with differentiated objects, marked by evenly matched giving and taking, the absence of primary identification, and an absence of incorporation. In this stage, you're relating as a whole, separate person to another whole, separate person. While this is the ideal, Fairbairn acknowledged it's never fully realized in practice, as human development rarely proceeds without some degree of internal compromise or hitch. We all carry some baggage from the earlier stages.
Fairbairn's most groundbreaking contribution to dynamic structure arose from his dream analysis of a frigid patient. In her dream, her father was killed by her mother for an incestuous relationship. This dream led Fairbairn to set aside Freud's egoid superego model in favor of a new tripartite model of the ego. This isn't just theory, it's a dramatic re-envisioning of the internal world. Can you walk us through his new model of the ego and its 3 dynamic structures?
Absolutely. This was truly revolutionary. He proposed that the ego isn't a single unified entity, but is instead split into three separate dynamic ego structures, all of which are actively interacting within us. First, there's the central ego, which he called the I. This is our observing ego, largely conscious and preconscious, dealing with external reality, like the patient's ambivalent conscious attitude to her husband. It's the part of us that tries to navigate the world, the part we usually think of as me. Second, there's the libidinal ego, which is highly endowed with libido, with emotional energy, and deeply attached to an exciting object. For the patient, this was her father or a father figure, or even her husband. Functionally, this highly charged desiring part corresponds roughly to what Freud called the id. It's the needy, yearning part. And third, we have the internal saboteur, an aggressive, persecutory ego, closely identified with a rejecting object, like the patient's critical mother. Its attack is vindictive, leading to profound anxiety, not necessarily guilt, and it corresponds functionally to Freud's superego, but it's an internal active persecutor rather than just a moral judge. It attacks the libidinal ego.
So the central ego represses these two subsidiary egos, the libidinal ego and the internal saboteur, which then operate unconsciously. And the aggression of that internal saboteur attacking the libidinal ego is a powerful factor in maintaining this repression, keeping those difficult feelings and relationships buried. That's a dynamic conflict right there. Fairbairn also saw the Oedipus situation differently through this lens.
That's right. The central ego's rejection constitutes the repression itself, and the dynamic for this rejection is aggression, often turned inward by the saboteur. Fairbairn saw the Oedipus situation not as a causal phenomenon, an inherent drive, but an end product, a derivative of infantile dependence. He believed it was a simplification where the child concentrates on the exciting aspect of one parent, related to the libidinal ego, and the rejecting aspect of the other, related to the internal saboteur. But at rock bottom, both the exciting and rejecting objects remain figures of the primary object, which is usually the mother. This means the foundational conflicts are pre-Oedipal, focused on that earliest, most significant relationship with the mother. It's all about the primal attachment bond and its inevitable frustrations.
It's a fundamental shift in focus from triangular family dynamics to the foundational mother-child bond. Fairbairn further illustrates these concepts with compelling clinical examples. Can you share one of those?
He described a patient's own vivid personification of her psyche. She had the mischievous boy who was irresponsible and phallic, much like the Freudian id or Fairbairn's libidinal ego, the critic, representing maternal authority and akin to the supergrago or internal saboteur, the little girl, her innocent central ego perhaps, and the martyr. This patient essentially gave Fairbairn a live-action play of his theory. These figures, for Fairbairn, function as dynamic structural units within the ego, explaining phenomena like multiple personality and even manic states as an invasion by the id, or in her terms, the mischievous boy. It showed how these internal parts could take on a life of their own.
And he also noted that the resistance to guilt over oral sadistic wishes often exceeded the resistance to the wishes themselves, which strongly suggests that the superego itself or the internal saboteur can be repressed. This challenges a basic Freudian assumption, doesn't it?
Indeed, it's a radical thought. Fairbairn concluded that the nucleus of the superego is pregenital at an oral level and must become established during that earliest oral stage of development. This repositions the origins of conscience and our internal moral compass much earlier in a child's life, tying it directly to the frustrations and challenges of those first, most critical object relationships, rather than just the later Oedipal conflict. It links back to that moral defense idea.
Okay, so Fairbairn didn't just confine his theories to the individual psyche. He extended his object relations framework to wider social issues, even examining the sociological significance of communism. What did he see in that political movement through an object relations lens? Seems like a big leap.
It might seem like a leap, but he saw connections. He viewed communism's goal of a world state as a further evolutionary step, aiming to bind individual libido, our core drive for connection and investment, to a supranational entity, effectively superseding the family and the nation. He argued that communism's implicit attack on the traditional family system is, in essence, an unconscious attempt to abolish the Oedipus conflict by eliminating its very source. If the family is the initial site of libidinal ties and the origin of the ego ideal through interjecting parents, then dismantling it could be seen as an attempt to eradicate the Oedipus situation and the internal conflicts it generates.
That's a fascinating, almost subversive interpretation of a political movement. But Fairbairn Ever the realist concluded that the biological basis of the family is simply too profound for ultimate extinction. He predicted that even a communist state would ultimately have to make terms with it.
Exactly. While social structures may evolve and diminish the family's direct influence, the profound biological and psychological need for familial figures remains, even if they manifest as benevolent godfathers in totalitarian leaders or the abstract state. The underlying human need for primary objects persists. Fairbairn also turned his incisive gaze to the academic world, reflecting on why psychoanalysis was often a prescribed subject in academic circles, frequently deemed unscientific. He argued that this resistance wasn't just intellectual.
So it wasn't just about scientific method, but something deeper. What was the underlying resistance, according to him?
Yes. He drew an interesting parallel. In drawing aside the veil which conceals the more primitive side of human nature, psychoanalysis is only performing within the scientific field a task which has been performed repeatedly outside that field by moral and religious reformers throughout the ages, citing St. Paul's writings on human wickedness. The resistance to psychoanalysis, he suggested, like opposition to new gospels, is fundamentally a defense of existing cultural defenses, protecting societal taboos and comfortable illusions about human nature. Psychoanalysis deals with sex, love, conscience, sin, guilt, hate, aggression, things society often prefers to keep veiled. Universities, he noted, often struggle between being guardians of traditional culture, which might mean prescribing certain subjects, and institutions for unrestricted scientific inquiry.
That's a powerful point. It raises an important question. How far human nature, in its present form, is capable of tolerating the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? He noted that a lot of knowledge can be dangerous if mishandled, potentially leading to destructive outcomes. Fairbairn, however, championed the university's role as an institution for unrestricted scientific inquiry, believing that psychoanalysis, despite its discomforting revelations, provides crucial knowledge for mastery over humanity's disruptive forces. He saw it as a vital tool for understanding and constructively influencing the conditions under which these elements are fostered or reduced.
His insights were significantly sharpened during his work with military personnel during World War II, leading to his profound understanding of war neuroses. This practical application is really revealing. He concluded that a traumatic experience is one which serves to precipitate a psychopathological reaction through the activation of pre-existing but hitherto latent psychopathological factors, rather than creating them de novo. The trauma acts as a trigger, an activator, not the sole cause. It brings to the surface what was already there, simmering beneath, usually related to unresolved infantile dependence.
Can you give us an example from his cases? Those are always so illuminating.
Absolutely. Consider Case 1. Gunner W.I., a soldier whose oil tanker was bombed. He's survived the inferno and the burning oil, which sounds incredibly traumatic. But the actual trauma for him, the thing that precipitated his breakdown, was not the bombing itself. Instead, it was a specific act that followed. When a drowning Chinaman pulled him down, and in a desperate act of self-preservation, he struck the Chinaman, seeing him sink. This particular act brought to focus a deeply repressed hatred of his father, acquiring the emotional significance of patricide. The external event triggered an internal, unresolved object relations conflict.
So the trigger wasn't the external horror per se, but something deeply internal and relational that the horror activated.
Precisely. Fairbairn concluded that the ultimate factor predisposing to all psychopathological developments is the undue persistence of an attitude of infantile dependence. War neuroses, he argued, are either effects of or defenses against conflicts arising from this persistent infantile dependence. The soldier is violently removed from familiar objects and supports, activating profound separation anxiety, which mirrors the earliest anxieties of the infant losing the mother.
This is clearly illustrated in Case 2, Gunner A.M., who, upon being called to military service, insisted his wife accompany him, called her daily, and was entirely preoccupied with her. She was, as he put it, like a mother to me, all I have. His bicycle had even become an umbilical cord to his doting maternal grandmother. Military service and the inevitable separation anxiety triggered debilitating fainting attacks. Similarly, Case 3, driver J.T., had suffered nocturnal enuresis since childhood, which returned with alarming frequency during war service in France due to separation anxiety from his home and loved ones. Then there's Case 4, Corporal J.F., who enlisted in the regular army and married just weeks before deploying to India. Separated from his wife for years, he meticulously planned their future life together, but international crises repeatedly thwarted his plans for discharge and reunion. This led to acute depression, suicidal attempts, drinking Lysol, and a complete breakdown of duty. He just wanted to be beside his wife, saying, "I just wanted to be beside my wife, war or nothing." These cases powerfully show the profound disruption caused when early dependencies are reactivated by stressful circumstances like war.
They really do. Fairbairn observed that identification is fundamental to war neurosis. The war neurotic regresses to an infantile emotional level, seeing superiors as bad parental figures and losing their sense of duty due to a collapse of the superego, which had been built upon those internalized relationships. While military views often dismissed neuroses as cowardice or malingering, Fairbairn insisted on the genuine suffering and the consuming desire to get out of the army and back to his home at all costs, war or no war. This was not malingering, but a profound disturbance of the personality driven by a collapse of internal object relationships and an inability to sustain the emotional bonds necessary for military service.
Fairbairn's object relations theory also extended to the treatment and rehabilitation of sexual offenders. How did he view their psychopathology, and what did he propose for their treatment? This seems like another challenging application.
It is challenging but consistent with his theory. He drew a crucial distinction. He separated psychoneurosis, where individuals suffer to control unacceptable tendencies and feel internal conflict, from perversion, where individuals often capitalize on perverse tendencies without significant internal distress. He argued that sexual perversion is a characteristic of a perverse personality structure itself, not just an unfortunate excrescence or a superficial symptom. For sexual offenders, therefore, the core problem is rehabilitation rather than traditional treatment, focusing intensely on their relationship to the social group. He drew an analogy between the sexual pervert and the psychoneurotic soldier. Both refuse to lead a normal life within their respective social groups, society's sexual norms, or military life.
But there's a crucial difference, isn't there? The psychoneurotic soldier pays a self-imposed personal price for his renunciation, implying some acknowledgement of social obligations and inner conflict. By contrast, the sexual pervert, in Fairbairn's view, pays no such self-imposed price. Characteristically, he regards his perversion as a personal asset, even despising community standards, and any distress he displays if he falls foul of the law is usually fear of losing social and material advantages rather than genuine guilt or moral conflict.
Exactly. Given this difference in internal structure and motivation, Fairbairn therefore advocated for group psychotherapy and special communities rather than traditional imprisonment. The aim would be to cultivate social relationships, allowing individuals to participate in a group life psychologically controlled with a view towards gradual approximation to the life of the community at large. This approach encourages a continuous process of social insight and social education in a setting of actual social situations. It was a profound rethinking of how society deals with those who deeply reject its norms, shifting from punishment towards fostering genuine social connection and integration.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground today. We've taken a comprehensive journey through W.R.D. Fairbairn's psychoanalytic studies of the personality, exploring his revolutionary ideas on object relations, the split ego, and the profound, enduring impact of our earliest relationships on our entire lives. These ideas shape everything from our individual psychology to the very structures of our society. It's truly a testament to the power of looking at familiar concepts with fresh eyes and digging deeper into the internal world to understand what truly drives us.
Fairbairn's work shows us, in vivid detail, that our greatest human vulnerability is also, ironically, our greatest strength, our inherent fundamental need for meaningful connection. He demonstrates how the core patterns of our personality are laid down in those earliest interactions, in the ways we internalize and relate to our primary objects. This raises an important question for you, our listener, to consider. In what ways do your current relationships, both internal, those voices and feelings within, and external, with others, reflect the enduring patterns set in your earliest experiences? And how might understanding these patterns empower you to forge more mature and fulfilling connections, shifting from unconscious, unconditional dependence, perhaps, towards more conscious, cooperative relating?
That's the challenge we leave you with. We challenge you to take these insights and apply them. Observe your own interactions, reflect on the whys behind your emotional responses, and see how Fairbairn's framework can truly enhance your understanding of yourself and others. While Fairbairn is no longer with us, his ideas certainly are. We encourage you to engage with the spirit of his work by seeking out contemporary authors and thinkers who continue to build on his legacy in object relations theory. Many of them are active on social media and welcome discussion, though maybe not Fairbairn himself, obviously.
Right. Engage with his ideas, his legacy.
If this podcast, this deep dive, has piqued your curiosity, we highly recommend getting your own copy of Psychoanalytic Studies of the Personality. It's a challenging read, no doubt, but incredibly rewarding and offers endless opportunities for deeper exploration.
It's one of those books that truly transforms how you see the world, and yourself in it. Definitely worth the effort.
Thank you for joining us on this in-depth exploration. We truly appreciate your active participation in this intellectual journey. If you enjoyed this podcast, please remember to follow the Playing Books podcast wherever you listen, subscribe to our channel, and share this episode with anyone you know who loves a good deep dive into the human mind. Until next time, keep reading, keep learning, and keep asking those big questions.